How much do we know about the life of Sabertooth after the events of X-Men Origins Wolverine in the Fox X-Men timeline? The trial run of Fox's Perspective Origin series came to an abrupt end with the lackluster reception of X-Men Origins Wolverine, which isn't very fondly remembered by fans so many years later. Perhaps all it's really known for anymore is the disgraced variant of Deadpool from the very end, as well as the iconic opening montage, but most of the film swings from outright passable to downright bad. Most of the film isn't outright bad until Deadpool is reintroduced, but this has since become everything that the film was memorable for. One of the highlights, though, was Logan's relationship with Victor Creed, otherwise known as Sabertooth, who was probably the best part of the entire film next to Wolverine. If anything besides Wolverine could be pulled into future projects, it would probably be this version of Victor Creed. But what happened to Creed after the events of Origins? Where is he now? And is there any evidence to suggest that he's actually not all there mentally anymore, and has now truly become something that he always was? More monster than man. Today, my friends, we will be taking a look at the story of Victor Creed past the events of X-Men Origins Wolverine. The first thing that we need to ask ourselves, though, is whether or not the events of X-Men Origins take place on the same timeline as the first X-Men trilogy, because if it does, then we do know where Victor ends up by the early 21st century. The Fox X-Men timeline is notoriously difficult to sift through and track, and there really isn't a right answer for how these timelines have been broken down. But we do believe that we have a workable depiction that does suggest the Origins takes place on the main timeline leading into the original X-Men movies. First, X-Men Origins can't take place in the same universe as Logan does, because the proper version of Deadpool that we know now stems from that universe, something we learned in Deadpool and Wolverine. So at this point, the Wolverine trilogy breaks into two different realities. We believe that this timeline breaks after the events of X-Men The Last Stand, and more specifically as a result of Days of Future Past. With that being the film that broke apart the timelines. Most of 2013's The Wolverine, we see Logan coming to terms with Jean's death in The Last Stand, and since The Wolverine foreshadows Logan's death at the end of Logan, then The Last Stand, The Wolverine, and Logan all take place on Earth 10,005, with the Deadpool that we know and love. But with that said, X-Men Origins does not exist on this timeline. At the end of Days of Future Past, Logan returns to the future to find that Jean is alive, indicating that the two did go through the events of X-Men and X-Men 2 together. Since this is where they first met, and this is how they know each other, we do believe that Origins could have reasonably happened on the same timeline as the first two X-Men movies. All of this is to say, though, that we believe the events of Origins leads into X-Men and X2, but not into The Last Stand. The reason we say this is because the timeline splits before The Last Stand ever takes place. Luckily for us, though, Victor Creed does appear in these movies. In the X3 tie-in video game, we do get to see the same version of Sabertooth, who seems to show some recognition to Logan. And although very specific details about Sabertooth are not mentioned in the game, the implication is that this is the version who knows Wolverine. Unfortunately, although this proves to be a great lead, we need to question the canon status of the game, since the Fox timelines are so cluttered. But if the game is in fact canon, then this is evidence that the two are the same character. Now that all of that is out of the way, though, let's get into what he may have been up to. The first thing we notice about Victor Creed is that he is much more savage than he previously appeared to be in Origins. He has inky black eyes, he doesn't speak very much, and seems to be an enforcer of Magneto, one that takes orders, but he doesn't have his own autonomy anymore, at least not the same extent that he did in Origins. Something is clearly changed with Sabertooth. In Origins, Victor is quite intelligent, and he was able to help Stryker further his plans to collect mutant abilities. But even though he was still the muscle for hire, he was much more intelligent than his appearances later. Luckily for us, though, there is evidence that some mutants with more animalistic mutations can be prone to devolving under certain conditions, and we do believe that Victor Creed essentially devolved. In one particular case in X-Men 25, Magneto ripped the adamantium out of Wolverine's body and left him on life support. Jean had to telepathically hold his body together for the healing factor to take over, and once Logan recovered, he was not the same. His mutation made him much more feral and aggressive than he was before, reverting back to his animalistic tendencies and revealing something horrific about his mutation. Wolverine here has broken mentally, not because of the torture that he's been through with having the adamantium placed in his body, but also because the adamantium had been working at holding back his mutation. Several different bestial mutants undergo something of a secondary mutation, and in the comics, a second mutation is rare, but it is not unheard of. If Wolverine has gone feral before as a result of significant trauma, then it is possible that Sabertooth has had the exact same thing happen, and that the version from the first X-Men movies is in fact the same Victor Creed from X-Men Origins. As to exactly why this happened is the big question, be it other experiments or something else. One very popular theory though proposes that Victor kept undergoing additional experiments at the hands of the Weapon X program, and while this helped to augment some of his mutant abilities, it made him larger in stature and more formidable in battle. It also took its toll on his mind, as it brought out the more savage nature of his mutation. Creed's mutation and Logan's are very similar, but they have a very bestial nature lying dormant within. This is actually the source of Logan's Berserker Rage ability, which are his animalistic instincts bubbling to the surface as a result of anger and bloodlust. Victor has the same thing. But this isn't just Logan being mad, it's literally his conscious human brain shutting down and switching over to his animalistic instinct, a deep desire to butcher people. And if Victor had the same piece lying deep within himself dormant, then there are any number of ways that this could have been brought to the surface. We believe that following Origins, Victor let his animalistic side run free, and over the course of 2 decades, it has finally fully consumed him. We do know that Victor is much more keen on violence than Logan ever was, and while Wolverine is certainly a violent individual, the Fox franchise usually depicts him as being a reluctant hero. He kills when he has to, and he does it well, but seldom does he ever go out of his way to hunt down and murder anyone that doesn't deserve it, and if he ever does, it's under very extreme circumstances. If Victor had to deal with this slow corrosion as a result of a more violent nature, then he could have simply ventured into the forest after the collapse of 3 Mile Island, living among the locals, off the grid for the greater part of 2 decades. We know that he's perfectly comfortable sleeping in the mud, tracking his prey through the woods like a forest predator, and eating whatever he can kill or catch. This may be how he grew to be feral, and we know that at some point, he does have to be found by Magneto in the timeline to make it fit. In the first X-Men, Magneto sends Sabertooth after Rogue, and the two are already working together by the time the movie begins. Magneto in this timeline is empathetic to the plight of other mutants, and he does believe them to be superior, but he appeals to them by understanding the struggles of what mutants are going through. He gives them promise of acceptance and a place full of people like them, which is an alluring offer that he's been practicing now for decades. For someone like Victor, who may not be entirely human anymore, this would be a very easy sell, since why he was one of Magneto's first and closest supporters. We don't see much of him after the first X-Men film, but we do believe that the first 2 movies take place on 2 different timelines because the timeline splits after X-Men 2. Again, because of Days of Future Past. This would mean that X-Men takes place on the same Earth as Logan, but it also deviates into the future timeline of Days of Future Past. So for this, let's specifically talk about where he is by the time Logan comes around, and what happened to Sabertooth. The year is 2029 when Logan occurs, and it's revealed that most mutants by this point in time are long dead, but is Victor included in this long death toll? We learn at the end of the movie that the primary cause for the downfall of mutant kind was a sort of cure that was baked into the food in this reality, slowly nullifying mutant abilities over time so that they could be hunted down and eradicated. Victor Creed, however, may not have to eat human-produced food, and he's actually one of the likeliest to survive this because he can live off of the grid. We're not outright suggesting that Victor is alive in Logan and in this timeline, just that if anyone can survive the conditions demonstrated in the world of Logan, it would be Victor Creed's Sabertooth. We do know that at one point, a variant of the character was banished to the void at the end of time, but right now we have no firm evidence to suggest that this is definitively the same version of the Sabertooth character. This variant could quite literally be any of one of infinite realities within the web of the multiverse. So while it's theoretically possible that this is the same one from the Fox timeline, we cannot say that it is with any level of certainty. But anyway friends, what do you think of the life of Sabertooth, and what happened to him? How his mutation essentially caused him to devolve? What do you think happened to him that caused him to go so feral? And do you hope that his story is concluded, or revealed one day in the future? As always my friends, Hulk smash that subscribe button for daily Marvel lore, and I hope you have a great day.